Hovering at an altitude of 7,000 meters, a single piece of evidence lay silent, buried under snow and ice, for 63 long years. For decades, the history books and climbing logs told a sanitary, acceptable version of the truth. A wealthy amateur had bought his way onto a K2 expedition, slipped on the treacherous slopes, and vanished into the void. It was tragic, sure, but in the eyes of the climbing world, it was just an accident. However, that sanitized narrative is a complete fabrication. The glacier, moving with the slow, grinding patience of geological time, has finally surrendered a dark secret. This new evidence transforms a simple, unfortunate slip into a bone-chilling horror story of abandonment, betrayal, and impossible endurance. The forensic truth is clear: he never fell. He was waiting. He sat there alive while the notorious death zone systematically shut down his body. How is it possible that a solitary frozen mitten could dismantle a myth that had solidified over half a century? And who was the man behind the tragedy? Glaciers are nature's vaults. They don't keep secrets for eternity, they just store them cold. They release their captives millimeter by agonizing millimeter. And in 2002, the ice finally decided it was time to expose one of mountaineering's darkest chapters. Let me paint the scene for you. Jennifer Jordan, a researcher with a keen eye for history, is trekking across the desolate expanse of the Godwin-Austen Glacier. It is a world of monochrome, white and gray, composed entirely of jagged rock, ancient ice, and a silence so profound it hurts the ears. Suddenly, the monotony breaks. She spots something that defies the landscape. There are bones bleached and frozen into the glacial crust alongside shreds of fabric that have been chewed apart by the relentless wind and time. Amidst this debris of a life lost long ago, one specific item stops her cold, causing her heart to skip a beat. It is a thick, weather-beaten mitten, stiff with age. On the leather, stenciled in ink that has barely survived the decades, are 5 distinct letters: WOLFE. It wasn't just a name, it was a legend. For generations of climbers, that name had been shorthand for the ultimate high-altitude mystery. Scattered near the remains are fragments of a wardrobe that speaks of a different world entirely. On a surviving label attached to a tattered garment, the prestigious tailor's mark is still legible: Cambridge. The doubt vanished instantly. It was him. This wasn't merely finding a body. It was an explosive revelation that shattered the bedrock of an accepted historical lie. For over 60 years, the mountaineering fraternity had held a unanimous verdict: Dudley Wolfe had become disoriented and tumbled from a snow-swept ridge. It was a clean, swift, and understandable way to die in the mountains. But the glacier is a witness that does not lie. The location where his remains surfaced was nowhere near the bottom of a precipice or a sheer drop. The body was found exactly where his final high-altitude camp had been pitched. This changes everything. He didn't slip, he didn't fall. He sat there completely alone, perhaps inside his tent or just outside it, staring down the mountain, waiting for a rescue team that had already given up. In an instant, that single mitten rewrites the finale of this tragedy, closing the book on a 63-year-old cold case. So we must ask, who was this Dudley Wolfe? Was he just a bored, wealthy adrenaline junkie looking for a thrill at the edge of the stratosphere? Or was he a tormented soul running away from something far more frightening than the abyss of K2? To find the answer, we have to look past the ice. To truly grasp how a man ends up abandoned in an icy tomb on the savage slopes of K2, we have to rewind the clock 43 years back to 1896. Dudley Wolfe wasn't just born into money, he was born into an empire. As the old saying goes, he didn't just have a silver spoon in his mouth, he had a diamond-encrusted ladle. His mother was the direct heiress to the massive Smith mining fortune, representing one of the most powerful families in America. We are talking about a level of wealth that, if calculated today, would sit comfortably in the hundreds of millions of dollars. This wasn't just purchasing power, it was a reality-warping force. It was a universe where barriers didn't exist and desires were fulfilled before they were even fully formed. His childhood was a blur of sprawling mansions, private academic tutors, and grand tours across Europe. For young Dudley, extreme luxury wasn't a privilege. It was oxygen. It was the only atmosphere he knew. His existence felt as permanent and unshakable as the granite bedrock from which his family had extracted their massive riches. Standing at the center of this opulent universe was his father, a man who seemed larger than life. He projected the image of a refined English aristocrat, a man of impeccable breeding and a swashbuckling past. He would regale his son with mesmerizing tales, stories of tracking tigers in the jungles of India, and rubbing shoulders with the upper crust of British high society. He carefully curated this aura of nobility and rugged bravery. To the impressionable young Dudley, his father wasn't just a parent, he was a god. He was the ultimate idol, the definition of honor and dignity. The boy spent his entire youth straining to emulate that ideal, desperate to prove he was worthy of such a magnificent lineage. But beneath the polished veneer and the glittering stories lay a rotting deception. It was a colossal lie that contaminated the entire family dynamic. The harsh truth was that Dudley's father was no English aristocrat. He was the son of a Jewish immigrant, a common tobacco merchant from the streets of New York. Every bit of his aristocracy, every thrilling anecdote, every affectation of nobility was a performance. It was a lifelong con wholly financed by his wife's mining fortune. He was a parasite living off her wealth, wearing a mask of nobility that had over the years fused so tightly to his face, he probably forgot who he really was. Now visualize Dudley as a young man. The First World War is raging. He is serving his country, perhaps facing the raw reality of life and death. For the first time, a place where a famous last name stops no bullets. And it is there, thousands of miles from the safety of home, that the shattering truth about his father finally catches up to him. The foundation of his identity disintegrates in a split second. The man he had placed on a pedestal was a total fraud. This revelation caused a seismic fracture in Dudley's psyche. On one hand, he possessed the tangible, immense power of his mother's money. On the other, he carried the shame of his father's cardboard aristocracy. This brutal contrast birthed a gnawing, malignant insecurity deep inside Dudley, a textbook case of severe imposter syndrome. He has the wealth, but he feels entirely undeserving of it. He begins to believe that just like his father, he is nothing more than an actor, playing a role of fraud in a rich man's costume. For the remainder of his days, Dudley would be driven by a frantic need to prove to the world, and more importantly to himself, that he was authentic. He needed to demonstrate that he was worthy of respect, not just because of his bank account, but because of who he was. This crusade for authenticity became an obsession, the central engine of his life. And then comes the first real test, a chance to prove his intellectual merit in a place where his mother's checkbook couldn't take the exams for him. He is enrolled in the prestigious Phillips Academy. This is the golden ticket, the preparatory step for the Ivy League, specifically Harvard. He enters the arena of the true elite, the meritocracy that supposedly cannot be bought. But this is where the tragedy begins to unfold. Dudley simply cannot keep pace. He pours every ounce of his soul into the work, but the academic rigor is miles beyond his natural ability. His official school record would eventually bear a heartbreaking notation, dismissed despite his conscientious efforts. Let those words sink in. He wasn't expelled for partying, laziness, or rebellion. He was kicked out because his absolute best wasn't good enough. For a young man already battling the internal voice calling him a fraud, this was an emotional death sentence. It felt as though the universe was screaming the quiet part out loud. You are a fake kid. You are just a hollow shell wrapped in expensive clothing. Standing in the ruins of his academic dreams, feeling exposed and worthless, Dudley makes a vow that will dictate his future. If his mind could not be his fortress, then he would turn his body into a weapon. He decides to methodically and brutally push his physical form to the absolute breaking point. He adopts discomfort and pain as his mentors. He begins a regimen of punishing physical exertion, seeking out suffering as a way to validate his existence. He acts like a blacksmith, determined to hammer the soft, inadequate metal of his character into unyielding steel. The freezing cold, the gnawing hunger, the muscle-tearing exhaustion, he welcomes them all. He is constantly searching for the next threshold, the next limit to break desperate, to find a breaking point that he can survive. Endurance becomes his new religion, his solitary path to redemption. He has no idea that this obsession with suffering will eventually lead him to the highest, most unforgiving forge on the planet. A place where the penalty for failure isn't a dismissal letter, but a slow, lonely death in the ice. Years grind on. Through sheer persistence, Dudley eventually forces his way into Harvard. But he is 29 years old. Imagine the scene, a graying, world-weary man sitting in a lecture hall surrounded by bright-eyed kids who are 10 years his junior. To them, he is a relic, an oddity. He is the strange rich guy who missed his window. He doesn't try to bridge the gap. He joins no clubs, attends no parties. He remains on the fringe, living in a self-imposed exile. He knows his battle isn't in the library anymore. His true arena is out on the athletic fields where effort can be measured in sweat and blood. He channels all that frustration into grueling endurance sports, open ocean sailing, long-distance cross-country skiing. He finds his currency here. It isn't the intellect that betrayed him, but pure grit, the ability to keep moving when others collapse. Every race against a gale, every mile on the snow. Is more than just a sport to him. It is a private war against his own demons, a battle against the shadow of the fraud father who left him feeling hollow. Dudley Wolfe is willing to pay any physical price to win that internal war, but these personal skirmishes are about to be overshadowed by a global catastrophe. The First World War has set Europe ablaze, and where others see horror, Dudley Wolfe sees his golden opportunity. This is his chance to earn real scars, to find validation that can't be questioned. He wants a medal that isn't from a yacht club regatta. He becomes obsessed with reaching the front lines. In 1916, he attempts to join the French Foreign Legion, a legendary outfit known for taking the desperate, the criminal, and the lost. And the result, they put him on a waiting list. Even among the world's rejects and mercenaries, he is told to wait. It is baffling, another blow to his fragile ego. "You're not ready," the silence seems to say, but he refuses to quit. As soon as the United States declares war, Dudley is the first one at the recruitment office. He is wealthy, he has trained his body into a machine, and he is eager to fight. And yet he is rejected again. The reasons are almost laughably humiliating: flat feet and poor eyesight. Think of the irony. The world is begging for men to hold rifles, and he, the man who has spent years training for hardship, is stamped unfit. His own body, the one thing he trusted, the one fortress he built to replace his intellect, has betrayed him. It must have felt like fate was mocking him, confirming his deepest fear that he was a counterfeit man, a pale imitation of what a soldier should be. But Dudley Wolfe was nothing if not persistent. When the front door slammed shut, he looked for a window. In 1917, he volunteered for the American Ambulance Field Service and shipped out to the chaotic Italian front. If they wouldn't let him shoot, he would drive into the fire to save those who did. Picture the environment: narrow, treacherous alpine roads completely exposed to Austrian artillery. And weaving through this nightmare, accompanied by the thunder of exploding shells, is Dudley Wolfe driving a clumsy, rattling tin can, a Ford Model T ambulance, desperate to prove his courage. Picture a man who has everything: the pedigree, the sprawling Boston mansion, and enough money to insulate himself from the ugly realities of the world. He should be safe at home, sipping scotch by a warm fire. Instead, he is driving straight into the mouth of hell, accelerating toward the chaos that every other sane person is fleeing. He is behind the wheel of an ambulance evacuating the mangled and the dying from the front lines of World War I, playing a deadly game of Russian roulette with every single mission. This isn't just a sense of patriotic duty. It is a deep, visceral need. He doesn't just tolerate the danger, he feeds on it. To his ears, the shrieking of shrapnel tearing through the air isn't a sound of terror, it is a symphony. It is the only music that makes him feel truly awake, confirming that he is flesh and blood. Finally, amidst the carnage, he finds the validation he has spent a lifetime chasing. For his reckless courage under fire, the Italian High Command pins the War Merit Cross to his chest. To a man like Dudley, that small, unassuming piece of bronze is worth more than every dime in his family's vault. It is the first tangible, undeniable evidence that he is more than just a checkbook in a suit. But the war does something else too. It burns a dangerous psychological pattern into his brain, rewiring his definition of existence. He realizes that he only feels whole, only feels the electric current of life when he is standing on the precipice of death. To him, a quiet, secure life is a fate worse than dying. It is synonymous with being meaningless. The real world, the only one that matters to him now, is a place where the lights could go out in a split second. But then the guns fall silent. The war ends, and for Dudley Wolfe, the peace brings a suffocating quiet. The thunder of artillery is replaced by the polite rustle of banknotes and the clinking of crystal glasses at dull society galas. He finds himself back in Boston, trapped in his gilded cage of privilege. The metal on his chest provides a fleeting sense of warmth, but it fades quickly. The adrenaline, which had become as essential to him as oxygen, is gone. Slowly but surely, the safety of his daily life begins to strangle him. He is desperate for a new adversary, a new chaotic element to subdue. He looks away from the land and finds his answer in a place where humanity has never been the master. the vast, unforgiving ocean. He decides that if he cannot fight soldiers, he will fight the waves. He turns his back on the idea of lazy, sun-drenched days sailing on the bay. For Wolfe, yachting is not a leisure activity. It is combat by other means. He weaponizes his fortune, pouring endless resources and manic energy into the world of ocean racing. This is far more than a sport to him. It becomes his personal school of survival, a place to test his mettle against the rawest forces of nature. He commissions the finest shipwrights of the era to construct a 60-foot schooner he christens the Mohawk. This is not some elegant toy for sipping champagne in the harbor. It is a beast, a true sea dog, engineered to smash through the Atlantic swells and survive the darkest storms. Then in 1929, he attempts the impossible. He carves his name into the history books, becoming the first person ever to race across the Atlantic Ocean in a vessel of this specific class. He effectively throws down the gauntlet to the icy gales and the towering waves. Just imagine the scene, a fragile wooden nutshell of a boat tossed around like a cork in the middle of a roaring infinite wilderness of water. And standing at the helm is one stubborn man, navigating by the stars, a simple compass, and the sheer force of his own will. This victory is no accident. Hungry for more, he purchases an even more advanced machine, the Highland Light, and begins sweeping up prestigious trophies, snatching victories from the most seasoned, salt-crusted captains on the globe. In these brutal races, he proves to the world, and more importantly to the critic in his own head, that he isn't just a dilettante with a heavy wallet. He reveals himself as a brilliant navigator, capable of plotting a course through weather conditions that would make lesser men crumble. He emerges as a natural-born leader, the kind of man a crew will follow into the heart of a hurricane without hesitation. Out on the open water, his illustrious family name and his millions are irrelevant. The ocean does not take bribes. Here, the only currency is endurance, technical knowledge, and guts. Out here, he is no longer a passenger in his own life. On the water, he is the captain. His word is absolute law. His split-second decisions are the only thing standing between a glorious triumph and a watery grave. He has effectively tamed the Atlantic. Standing on the heaving deck of his yacht, soaked to the bone in freezing salt spray, Dudley Wolfe finally feels like he belongs. He has found his element, and the taste of absolute control over the chaos is intoxicating. He has proven he can win. But victory brings a new problem. He has run out of challenges. At 37 years old, when most men are looking to settle down and enjoy their wealth, Dudley Wolfe is scanning the horizon for a new war to fight. The ocean has been subdued, but that nagging itch in his soul, that insatiable thirst for confrontation, remains unquenched. He soon identifies a new enemy. It is inhospitable, silent, and vertical. He turns his gaze to the mountains. Yet there is a paradox here. He isn't led into this freezing, jagged world by a hardened veteran, but by his wife, Alice Damrosch. Alice is not merely a New York socialite. She is a highly skilled, passionate skier. For her, the mountains are not a battlefield to be conquered, but a canvas for beauty. She sees the slopes as a stage for an elegant dance, with nature a place of grace rather than conflict. She is the one who convinces Dudley that the ultimate height isn't found on the crest of a rogue wave, but on a snow-covered peak, looking down on the ant-like bustle of the world below. Being a man who cannot resist a dare, he agrees. And just like that, the millionaire, war hero, and champion captain becomes a humble student all over again. They travel to Austria, enrolling in the legendary ski school of Hannes Schneider. Here, surrounded by the majestic spires of the Alps, Wolfe, a man accustomed to barking orders, must learn to shut up and listen. He trades the command deck for a pair of wooden skis and attempts to master his first slope. He starts clumsily flailing like a beginner, but his confidence grows with every run. In the process, he uncovers a new dangerous addiction. But he quickly realizes a hard truth: the mountains are not the ocean. On the water, you can buy the fastest boat and hire the best crew to handle the ropes. Here, gravity demands personal skill, something his bank account cannot purchase. So he settles for the only option left. He adopts the client guide approach. Think of it like hiring the world's best rally driver to take you down a cliffside road. You might be sitting in the passenger seat, but you are still just a passenger. The professional is the one controlling the wheel, knowing every twist, turn, and danger zone. For Wolfe, that driver is Otto Furrer, one of the premier mountain guides of his generation. The dynamic is a complete reversal on his yachts. Wolfe was the absolute master of his domain. In the high mountains, he is merely a wealthy client paying a premium to be led by the hand. Together with Fur, he tackles incredibly grueling ski traverses in the Mont Blanc Massif, slogging across glaciers and navigating treacherous passes. It is here that his greatest, almost supernatural talent reveals itself. Wolfe possesses a phenomenal physical engine. He can march for hours on end without fading. His stamina is so immense, it evokes envy even in the professional guides. He is the perfect piece of cargo, one that walks itself and never needs to be carried. But there is a dark side to this strength, a fatal flaw that goes unnoticed in the beginning. He is a Ferrari engine mounted in a car with no steering wheel. He cannot read the nuances of the ice, he doesn't know how to properly secure a rope to a rock face, and he has no instinct for avalanche risks. He is completely, utterly dependent on his guide for survival. Every critical decision, from the route they take to the minute they stop to drink water, is made by someone else. For a man who has spent his entire adult life seeking total control, this is a bizarre, almost humiliating position. He stands at the foot of his new obsession, strong as an ox, but as helpless as a newborn kitten without another pair of eyes to see the danger for him. He has learned how to exist in the mountains, but he hasn't learned the language of the mountains. He doesn't understand them. And this single detail, this critical reliance on others to keep him alive, is the seed that will eventually grow into his destruction. The elegant dance with the elements is about to end. The collapse happens not on a snowy ridge, but in a dry courtroom. By 1938, his marriage to Alice, the very woman who opened the gates to this alpine world, disintegrates. She, with her technical grace, saw mountaineering as art. He, with his obsessive drive, saw the peaks as enemies to be crushed. Their paths could no longer run parallel. The mountains, which were supposed to be their shared playground, now become his lonely sanctuary. Or perhaps they become the battlefield for a war against his own demons. Left alone, Wolfe decides to prove to the world that he is more than just a tourist with a checkbook. He declares himself a true mountaineer. He sets his sights on the holy grail of the Alps Mont Blanc. But this time he wants a full-blown ascent, not just a ski traverse, however the mission unravels. Was it the weather? Maybe. But more likely, the failure lay elsewhere. His navigator, this time, isn't as infallible, and Wolfe's own internal compass is broken. The expedition stalls, and he is forced to retreat in shame. He immediately launches an ambitious attempt to traverse Piz Palu in the Bernina Range. That, too, ends in failure. These two back-to-back defeats are like sledgehammer blows to his ego, cracking the facade of the invincible conqueror. They ruthlessly expose the truth his expensive guides had managed to hide. Dudley Wolfe is physically indestructible, but technically incompetent. His incredible engine is roaring, ready to climb forever. But without an expert driver, without someone else's brain and hands to guide him, all that raw power is useless. The machine simply spins off the track at the first sharp corner, careening into the abyss. And here's the fascinating part. Every failure paradoxically strengthens his reputation, but in a very specific backhanded way. In the tight-knit fraternity of mountaineering, the whisper about him becomes, that Wolfe guy doesn't know a bowline knot from a shoelace, but my God, the man can walk until the end of time. Witnesses to his failed attempts bring back stories of him breaking trail through waist-deep snow for hours, never slowing his relentless pace, while seasoned climbers collapsed from exhaustion behind him. He becomes known as a human machine, the ideal Sherpa, only this one has white skin and a bottomless bank account. His endurance becomes the stuff of legend, a myth retold over beers in alpine huts. But crucially, no one is asking him to lead the rope on a technical route. He is viewed as a valuable asset, a beast of burden, but never a leader. For Wolfe, this breeds a deep, festering bitterness. The divorce has left a gaping hole in his life, and the failed climbs only rub salt in the wound. He isn't just looking for another peak to bag, he is looking for redemption. He needs a project on a titanic scale, a challenge so immense and terrifying that it will consume him completely and erase the sting of his recent defeats. He needs a mountain so vast, so imposing that against its backdrop, all his personal dramas and technical shortcomings would simply turn to dust. He needs a mountain that won't test his ability to tie knots, but will test his one true, almost supernatural power, his ability to suffer and keep moving. It was a test of pure endurance, a singular drive to simply keep ascending until the mountain surrendered or his own heart gave out. There was no middle ground. And before long, that colossal peak would loom large on his horizon, a silent giant waiting to test his resolve. But destiny wouldn't arrive as a storm or an avalanche. Instead, it would walk through the door in the shape of a man. In the high-stakes universe of mountaineering, certain names are whispered, like legends carrying a weight of awe and respect. During the late 1930s, Fritz Wiesner was one of those titans. Born with German discipline but fueled by a distinctly American ambition, he was widely considered one of the absolute finest climbers to ever touch rock and ice during his era. He was technically brilliant, utterly fearless, and possessed a mind that bordered on genius when it came to reading a route. But he also harbored a dream, or perhaps more accurately, a consuming obsession that matched the intensity of any tragic hero. Wiesner was assembling an American expedition to conquer the second highest point on Earth. This was the Savage Mountain, a peak so ruthless and unforgiving that the mere mention of it sent shivers through even the most battle-hardened veterans. His sights were locked on K2. Wiesner possessed every intangible asset required for success: years of hard-won experience, a meticulous tactical plan, and a roster of America's most capable climbers. However, reality had a way of intervening. He lacked the one tangible necessity that fueled every great endeavor: money. Launching an expedition of this sheer magnitude required a king's ransom, and Wiesner's personal budget had already been stretched until it snapped. He desperately needed a financial savior, a patron of the arts and adventure, to fill the massive void in his ledger, and that necessity set the stage for a collision of two very different worlds. Visualize the setting: a glittering high society cocktail party in the heart of New York City. The air is filled with the murmur of polite gossip and the delicate chime of crystal champagne flutes. Fritz Wiesner stands there, likely ignoring the social pleasantries, his eyes scanning the crowd not for friends, but for a lifeline. That is when his gaze locks onto Dudley Wolfe. Wiesner didn't just see a wealthy heir dressed in an expensive tailored suit. He looked at Wolfe with the calculating eyes of a prize-fight promoter, sizing up a contender. He noted the sheer width of the man's shoulders, the barrel chest, and that undeniable energy of raw brute strength that seemed to vibrate off him. To a strategist like Wiesner, Wolfe wasn't a person to be charmed. He was a human locomotive, the exact kind of engine required to power a climb into the death zone. Wiesner was blissfully unaware of Wolfe's distinct lack of technical finesse in the Alps. It didn't matter. What he saw was exactly what the mountain demanded: a reservoir of endurance that seemed hardwired into the man's genetic code. The conversation that sparked between them in that crowded room would alter the course of history for everyone involved. This was far from a casual chat between two enthusiasts bonding over alpine vistas. It was a cold, hard business transaction. Wolfe, a man desperate to carve out a legacy and prove his worth, viewed K2 as his ultimate shot at redemption, his own personal Everest. He was willing to pay any price for glory, and he paid a heavy one, essentially writing a check that covered the vast majority of the entire expedition's operating costs. He spent a small fortune just to secure a single seat on the roster. For Wiesner, this windfall was nothing short of a miracle. But he wasn't just securing the funds he so desperately needed. He was acquiring the human asset he had identified in Wolfe from the moment they made eye contact: the ultimate workhorse. The expedition leader was a pragmatist to his core. He understood that at the crushing, oxygen-deprived altitudes of K2, where the air is razor-thin and the snowpack's waist-deep elegance means nothing, raw primal power is the only thing that moves the needle. He didn't need another technical artist. His team was already stacked with virtuosos. He needed a human bulldozer, someone capable of breaking trail through fresh powder for hours without collapsing, hauling the heaviest loads, and punching a hole through the elements for the elite climbers to follow. Wolfe's role was cast in stone before they even packed a single bag in New York. He was destined to be the expedition's muscle, the blunt instrument to be used against the vast white slopes. As for the delicate, high-consequence maneuvering the complex rope work on vertical rock faces and blue ice, Wiesner intended to reserve those tasks for himself and the other experts. Wolfe was there to carry the load, not to lead the dance. The pact is sealed. Dudley Wolfe has effectively purchased the most expensive one-way ticket of his life passage on a steamship destined for the foothills of the world's most lethal mountain. He has successfully bought his way into the game. The tragedy, however, is that he has absolutely no understanding of the rules he is about to play by. As the ship departs, it carries the most bizarre and discordant orchestra ever assembled. That description isn't a metaphor, it is a fact. The 1938 expedition had functioned like a tight-knit chamber ensemble where every member instinctively knew the other's rhythm. But this team, the class of 1939, was a chaotic collection of talented soloists who had never played a single note together. Many of these men were shaking hands for the very first time on the deck of the ship. They weren't bound by a brotherhood of shared struggle, but by the gravity of Wiesner's checkbook and his personal Rolodex. They shared no past. There were no war stories, no history of shared triumphs or survived disasters to glue them together when things got tough. The cracks in the foundation were visible while they were still thousands of miles from the Himalayas. Wolfe, despite being a rookie in the climbing world, possessed the sharp analytical mind of a modern businessman. He assesses the monumental task ahead looking for risk mitigation strategies. He spots a glaring vulnerability, immediately communication. He approaches Wiesner with a logical, brilliant suggestion. Fritz, this mountain is a beast. Our camps will be separated by hours, maybe days of climbing. Let me purchase the finest, lightest portable radio sets money can buy. We can track every team's status in real time. He is offering to spend even more of his own fortune to ensure safety and logistical coordination. It seems like the most obvious decision in the world. Who would refuse such an advantage Wiesner does? Without hesitation. His refusal strikes like a slap in the face to modern logic. Radios, that is unsportsmanlike. For Wiesner, a climbing purist and a disciple of the old school, the mountain was a sacred arena where man pitted himself nakedly against the elements. Relying on technology was a form of cheating a crutch that cheapened the spiritual value of the ascent. He viewed mountaineering as a romantic, chivalrous duel, not a complex military operation. This philosophical stance, delivered so casually on the ship's deck, would become the single pebble that triggers a catastrophic avalanche. They are knowingly walking into a world of silence and blindness, completely oblivious to the horrific price that decision will extract. But the structural flaws of this expedition weren't just about equipment. They ran deep into the psyches of the men themselves. Wiesner's second-in-command is Tony Cromwell, a man who carries himself as if the entire weight of the sky is resting on his neck. He is an organizational genius, certainly, but his soul is that of a profound pessimist. Cromwell is the type of character who sees a blizzard in every cloud and prepares for the worst-case scenario before the sun has even risen. His incessant doubts and dark prophecies begin to corrode the team's morale like rust long before they ever strap on a crampon. And standing in stark contrast to him is Jack Durrance, young, aggressively ambitious, and physically gifted. Durrance is a climber who isn't accustomed to playing second fiddle to anyone. He observes Wiesner's rigid, authoritarian leadership style with visible disdain. Jack is used to a more democratic, collaborative approach where tactics are debated. Wiesner, conversely, operates like a dictator who views questions as insubordination. From day one, the friction between them is palpable. But this isn't the friction that sharpens iron. It's the static charge before a lightning strike. Two alpha males bound for the same rope, yet destined for conflict. In this toxic atmosphere, weighted down by internal strife, the team finally approaches the base of K2. The mountain hasn't even begun to reveal its true fury, yet the men are already unknowingly drafting the architectural plans for their own destruction. And so they arrive. It is June. They stand at the foot of the giant. The blueprint for failure sketched out on the ship is now hardening into a cold, terrifying reality. Base camp is established, but the mountain has no interest in waiting for the starting gun. It begins its ruthless selection process immediately. This isn't a competition between the climbers anymore. It is a duel against the thinning air, the biting wind, and the limitations of their own biology. Ironically, the first to fail this brutal audition are the very ones everyone expected to excel. The young, vibrant, athletic Eaton Cranmer and Dudley Sheldon. You would assume they'd be bounding up the slopes, setting the pace. Instead, their bodies go into total revolt. The altitude drains the vitality right out of them. Their stomachs reject food, and every single step becomes a torture session. The mountain, acting like a cruel and discerning judge, cuts them from the team, first demonstrating that youthful swagger has no value in the death zone. So what of the veterans, Wiesner's deputy, the eternal pessimist Cromwell, and his nemesis Durrance, seem to be hauling the heavy baggage of their personal grievances along with their gear. They move sluggishly without fire or inspiration. Their technique is precise, but it lacks heart. They are professionals clocking in for a shift in hell, but their fighting spirit was extinguished before the real battle commenced, and then shockingly, the most unlikely protagonist steps into the spotlight. Dudley Wolfe. The man dismissed as a wealthy tourist, the one many considered dead weight rises to the occasion. While the young athletes are vomiting in the snow and the seasoned pros are bickering in the tents, Wolfe simply clamps his jaw shut and climbs. His stamina is nothing short of miraculous. He isn't fast, and he certainly isn't graceful, but he operates like a diesel engine, churning slowly, stubbornly, relentlessly upward. He hauls loads, he secures fixed ropes, and he proves that raw willpower can eclipse years of technical training. Then, the inevitable fracture occurs. The team splits apart. Wiesner, recognizing that Wolfe is the only other soul who shares his feverish hunger for the summit, creates a vanguard unit. It stops being a team and becomes us versus them. A summit party, essentially just 2 men and a handful of porters, charges for the peak, leaving a demoralized, exhausted support group trailing miles behind. The climbers and the stragglers. The gap between them ceases to be measured in feet or meters. It is now measured in days. And in this widening abyss, information dies. Remember, Wiesner's refusal on the ship. Radios are unsportsmanlike. Now, that sentence doesn't sound like a noble principle. It sounds like a death warrant. The vanguard is now completely blind and deaf to the chaos unfolding below. Base camp is left to speculate on the fate of the men in the clouds, staring into the frozen silence. The tension thickens like a suffocating fog, and no one knows when or if it will ever lift. It is July 13th. We are sitting at an elevation of 7,500 meters above the crashing waves of the ocean. Up here, the atmosphere doesn't just feel thin to the lungs, it feels fragile, almost breakable, like a sheet of tempered glass waiting to shatter. Taking a single breath becomes a grueling labor, a physical battle against the elements. Every time you manage to exhale, it registers as a tiny, hard-won triumph against the suffocating pressure. Wiesner, alongside Wolfe, and a select group of the most resilient Sherpas finally claw their way into Camp 7. You have to understand this isn't merely another resting point on the map. This is the absolute threshold of the peak, the final staging area before the ultimate ascent begins. If you looked into their eyes right now, you would see a terrifying combination, the burning fire of fanatical determination warring with the hollow, glazed look of complete physical depletion. The civilization awaiting them far below has ceased to feel like reality. It has been reduced to nothing more than a topographical chart, a meaningless swirl of valleys and jagged ridges they can no longer relate to. They have effectively taken up residence in the heavens. However, this is a hostile sky that rejects intruders. At this precise second, a solitary figure is beginning a slow, agonizing descent from Camp 7. That man is Durrance. The mountain has rendered its final verdict on him. His brain, starved of precious oxygen, is ringing with internal sirens. A splitting migraine tears through his skull. His legs have transformed into dead weight, and his vision swims in and out of focus. Retreat is no longer a choice, it is a biological necessity. As he stumbles downward, fighting for balance, he pauses to cast one final longing glance toward the heights. Distant black dots against the white snow that is all that remains of his teammates in his field of view. He keeps his eyes locked on them until they disappear completely over the crest of an icy ridge. Just like that, they vanish. The final curtain has dropped on this act. This marks the absolute last moment that any member of the support crew will ever lay eyes on the summit team while they are still healthy and alive. When he finally staggers into Camp 4, his sudden appearance strikes the group with the force of an explosion. He is alone. Why is he by himself? What happened to the rest of the squad? Durrance, barely possessing the cognitive function to string a sentence together, attempts to justify it. They kept going. They are okay. However, his wrecked physical condition screams a terrifyingly different narrative. From that split second onward, the support crew enters the most torturous phase of mountaineering, the waiting game. They are plunged into the terrifying abyss of the unknown. Their high-powered binoculars are rendered futile against the terrain. The skyline remains hauntingly empty. They possess no radio equipment. There are no signal flares to fire. There is simply zero method to determine what is transpiring thousands of meters above in the freezing stratosphere. This is the juncture where their purest climbing philosophies transform into a snare of their own design. Although they stand at the mountain's base, they might as well be incarcerated in solitary confinement, isolated in a total vacuum of information. Meanwhile, far above the clouds, Dudley Wolfe is coming to a bone-chilling realization about his predicament. He realizes he is the sole client, the only non-professional climber remaining at this extreme altitude. The safety of the large American expedition has evaporated. He is now merely a passenger, tethered by a rope to a climbing prodigy obsessed with the peak and men of superhuman strength from a different culture. His affluent social circle, his life of comfort and ease back home, all of those things exist in a separate dimension now. Up here, the universe consists only of himself, Wiesner, and the savage peaks. The machinery of catastrophe, primed by their stubborn refusal to carry wireless radios, suddenly locks into gear with a sound of deafening permanence. Every 60 seconds of silence that ticks by is now actively conspiring against their survival. On the slopes of K2, silence is not merely the lack of noise. It evolves into a central character in this tragedy. It becomes the primary villain. It is now July 14th. The atmosphere at this height acts like a bandit in the night. It is not simply thin air. And it is a vampire that siphons the warmth from your blood, saps the power from your muscles, and fogs your cognitive abilities. Yet for Fritz Wiesner and Paseng Lama, navigating this lethal zone is standard operating procedure. They operate with a systematic, almost robotic efficiency. Every gesture they make is calculated, economical, and flawless. They are busy organizing their equipment for the ultimate bivouac Camp 8. Their destination is a slender shelf of rock, sitting at nearly 8,000 meters. It is a launch pad from which only one final assault is needed to claim the summit. Together, they function as a biological engine designed for a solitary goal. Dudley Wolfe observes them, and deep down he understands. He is constructed from entirely different material than these men. He attempts to match their pace, hauling himself upright, to force one heavy boot in front of the other. But his physiology is shrieking in protest. His lungs burn with an intensity that suggests they are filled with shards of broken glass rather than air. His legs, weighed down by massive boots, feel as though they have been cast in solid lead. Looming directly in front of them is not a simple snowy incline, but a near-vertical chimney of ice. This feature demands far more than brute stamina. It requires absolute technical mastery. It is a level of dexterity that the depleted Wolfe simply no longer possesses. He halts, collapsing his weight onto his ice axe, and can only stare at the retreating figures of Wiesner and Paseng as they gain distance. The expedition leader pauses and glances back. There is no accusation in his gaze, nor is there pity, only a cold recognition of the reality. A brief, subtle nod is exchanged. Words are unnecessary. Wolfe is remaining behind. He pivots and trudges back toward the minuscule tent at Camp 7. This is the moment the true nightmare commences. He is now officially in solitary confinement. He sits on a frozen balcony at the roof of the world at an elevation of 7,600 meters. The silence at this altitude is not tranquil. It is heavy, crushing, and malevolent. The quiet presses against him, compressing his skull until his ears begin to ring. The only audio in this deceased universe is the violent whipping of the wind against the fragile nylon of his shelter. Wolfe slithers into his sleeping bag, but it fails to provide the comfort of a sanctuary. Instead, it wraps around him with the distinct feeling of a burial shroud or a tomb. This leads us to the most horrific aspect of his predicament. He is completely without supplemental oxygen. There is not a single canister to aid him. He is inhaling the same rarefied toxic atmosphere that is systematically extinguishing his brain function neuron by neuron. His mission is now laughably basic yet terrifyingly intricate. To wait, he must simply exist until Wiesner and Paseng descend from the peak. He cannot afford to move a muscle. He must hoard every single calorie and ration, every gasp of air. He must transform himself into a statue of flesh and bone. However, holding position at this elevation is far from a passive activity. It is a dynamic war against his own biology which is pleading with him to descend to safety. Every 60 minutes endured up here takes a toll equivalent to a week of living at sea level. His cognition becomes knotted as viscous as tar. History and the future smear together into a foggy haze of the immediate present. He ceases to be a wealthy American. He is no longer an explorer. He is reduced to a lone sentinel standing watch over the sputtering candle of his own existence. The thumping in his chest is no longer the rhythm of life, but the countdown of a clock he did not wind. The first day passes, then the second. Or perhaps it is already the third time flows by different rules in this place. It does not tick forward. It drips agonizingly slow like water bleeding from a thawing icicle. For Dudley Wolfe, every dawn and every dusk is not merely a calendar change. It represents another hard-fought triumph against the void and the freezing temperatures. His entire reality has contracted to the dimensions of this nylon shelter, and his whole cosmos has narrowed to the audio of his own respiration, ragged and insufficient. The air here is a deceiver. It fills the space, yet it contains almost no life-sustaining properties. His brain is famished, and his consciousness is turning into a thick swamp, where his memories, his ambitions, and even his own name begin to submerge and disappear. His most formidable adversary now is thirst. It is a brutal contradiction. He is physically encased in millions of tons of frozen water, yet he is slowly perishing from dehydration. To obtain a solitary cup of liquid, he must melt a mountain of snow, and that process requires fuel and physical exertion. It demands the exact reserves of energy his body is frantically trying to hoard, just to prevent him from freezing to death during his slumber. It is a deadly loop. His physiology is a candle being incinerated from both ends. The external frost sucks the warmth from his skin, while the internal lack of oxygen and hydration burns him from the inside out. The sensation of hunger has vanished. All that remains is an overwhelming drought-like thirst and a dull rhythmic pounding inside his skull. You have to grasp the context. In the year 1939, this was a survival record beyond comprehension. No human being had ever endured this duration of isolation at this crushing altitude in the death zone, completely devoid of artificial oxygen. Every single hour he survives up here contradicts everything medical science understands about human biology. Wolfe has gone far beyond his breaking point. He is existing on borrowed time, accruing a massive debt to his own physiology that must eventually be paid. And somewhere far above him, in the higher reaches of this frozen hellscape, Wiesner and Passang are presumably still forging ahead. Or are they? Wolfe has absolutely no way to verify. He is severed from all contact. For all he knows, they could be standing on the peak this very moment cheering their victory. Alternatively, they could have plummeted into a dark crevasse days ago. The agony of ignorance is heavier and more crushing than the thin atmosphere itself. Even tragic news would be preferable to this absolute void. Any signal, a distant scream, anything at all would be welcome. But there is zero input, just the howling gale. So why does he not descend? His primal survival instincts must be shrieking at him, pleading with him to crawl back down to the world of the living. Yet he refuses to move. He gave a promise. He is awaiting his captain. This fidelity, this sheer unyielding obstinacy, it is the solitary thread giving his existence purpose. 7 full days have evaporated. 7 infinite rotations of daylight and darkness. Dudley Wolfe has ceased to be an American millionaire. He is transformed into a living testament to human willpower, frozen like a gargoyle at 7,600 meters. Meanwhile, merely a few hundred vertical meters above his head, the concluding act of a separate tragedy is playing out. It is now July 19th. Fritz Wiesner and Passang Lama are positioned at an altitude of 8,370 meters. The absolute apex of the planet is a mere 240 meters away. To put that in perspective, that is less than the architectural height of the Eiffel Tower. It is right there. They can practically taste the air of the summit. The triumph is so tantalizingly close, it feels as if they could simply extend a hand and brush against the fabric of the heavens. However, lying directly before them is a fork in the road. It is a decision point that will dictate their fate. To their left lies a broad, comparatively secure ice couloir. It is a direct line, an unobstructed passage. Essentially, a highway of snow leading straight to the pinnacle. To their right looms a sheer, near-vertical fortification of stone known as the Rock Bastion. It is technically treacherous and fraught with peril, yet for a mountaineer of Wiesner's elite caliber, it presents an irresistible allure. He makes his decision. He banks right, aiming directly for the rock face. Why, perhaps it was hubris. Maybe it was a burning desire to climb the route, to conquer the most punishing line and demonstrate his total dominance over the peak. He is a purist, a genuine alpinist, not simply a trudger of snow. For a man like him, the goal isn't merely arriving at the summit, it is entirely about the style in which you arrive. Passang glances at his commander, a silent interrogation burning in his eyes. His vast experience and his Sherpa intuition are screaming that the snow path is the logical choice, it is faster, and it is infinitely safer. But the command of the Sahib, the expedition leader, is absolute law. Without a word of protest, he follows Wiesner onto the vertical labyrinth of stone. Time is bleeding away, and every second lost is a step closer to disaster. The rock face here is far more deceptive than it appeared from below, turning every single vertical meter into a brutal physical brawl against gravity. To make matters worse, the sun is already dipping low, scorching the icy horizon and bathing the jagged peaks in a blood-red warning light. The countdown to survival has officially begun. Deep down, Wiesner runs the numbers and realizes the terrifying truth: they aren't going to make the summit. Continuing the climb now would force them to descend through the death zone in pitch blackness, a scenario that guarantees a fatal outcome. With a heavy heart, he swallows his pride and makes the call to abort. It is a crushing defeat. Just 240 meters, a mere 240 meters, stood between him and mountaineering immortality. Try to visualize the sheer weight of that disappointment, the bitter taste of coming so close only to turn around. Exhausted and broken in spirit, they begin the long climb down. But then the mountain delivers a cruel twist that destroys any hope of a safe return. Navigating a particularly slick patch of ice, Pasang loses his footing. He scrambles to arrest his fall, but in that violent split second, disaster strikes his crampons. Those essential steel claws needed to grip the ice are ripped violently from his boots. There is a sickening, singular sound of metal clattering against stone, and then silence as the gear plummets into the bottomless void below. That's it. The game is over. Without those spikes navigating the ice, couloir is physically impossible. The mountain has instantly transformed from a climbable surface into a frictionless slide of death, leaving them with only one desperate direction to move. Straight down. The glorious summit of the world is forgotten. Now their entire universe focuses on a tiny canvas tent thousands of feet below. That is where Dudley Wolfe has been holding out, waiting for their return for 9 long days. The journey down becomes a nightmare of endurance. It takes 2 full days, 2 days of excruciatingly slow, terrified movement to descend what should have been a quick return. They had fought with everything they had to claim those meters on the ascent, and now they had to yield them back to the mountain in defeat. But the adrenaline of the climb was gone. They weren't fueled by the fire of ambition anymore. They were running on fumes, battling fingers blackened by frostbite and a hollow, gnawing emptiness in their guts where hope used to be. Their reality had collapsed into a simple rhythmic torture, the crunch of frozen snow under boot soles, the ragged burning gasps for thin air, and a single obsession reached the tent. Get to Dudley Wolfe. Finally, on July 21st, 2 ghost-like figures stumble out of the blinding white nothingness. Wolfe, who has been ravaged by the isolation of 9 days and the crushing physical toll of the high-altitude spots, Wiesner and Pasang struggling toward him. You can see the desperate battle between hope and dread in his eyes, but he doesn't need to ask. The way their shoulders slump, the way their heads hang low, it tells him the whole story instantly. The summit remained untouched. A suffocating silence fills the cramped interior of the high-altitude tent. The news of the aborted climb is bad, but the loss of the crampons is a catastrophe. It changes everything. Their food is nearly gone. Their physical reserves are tapped out. Staying at this altitude means certain death. There is no debate. They have to move. They must get down to Camp 7, their only sanctuary. Picture the desperation in their minds. They are practically already there. They can hallucinate the comfort of it, the thick down sleeping bags, the taste of hot soup, the psychological safety of a sturdy shelter. Camp 7 isn't just a grid coordinate anymore. It has become their promised land, a life-saving oasis in the middle of a frozen white desert. The following day, July 22nd, the 3 men embark on the most harrowing section of their retreat. Wolfe has deteriorated. He is so frail he can barely lift his legs. Wiesner and Pasang, who can hardly stand themselves, are essentially dragging him down the mountain. This is no longer a mountaineering descent. It is a slow-motion, desperate rescue operation. And then through the haze of their utter exhaustion, a beacon appears. The bright yellow fabric of the tent at Camp 7 cuts through the white. A final surge of adrenaline pushes them forward. They stumble, practically falling into the campsite, desperate for a greeting, expecting to hear the voices of their teammates. But something feels wrong. The air hangs heavy with an eerie, unnatural stillness. No one unzips a tent to wave them in. Fighting back a rising sense of dread, Wiesner staggers to the first tent. He rips back the entrance flap and freezes cold. It's hollow, completely barren. No sleeping bags, no stove for melting snow, not even a stray crumb of food remains. Panic rising, he scrambles over to the second tent only to discover the exact same nightmare. Everything is gone. Someone has stripped the camp clean. This isn't just a disappointment, it is a physical blow to the gut, breathless and violent. It feels as though a lifeline was severed the exact moment they grabbed it. They are completely alone without food or warmth, stranded at 7,500 meters. The mountain hasn't just beaten them, it has slammed the door on their survival. This has escalated from a difficult extraction to a full-blown catastrophe. The invisible timer on their lives has just begun to race towards zero. But how could a mistake of this magnitude possibly happen? To comprehend this chilling error, we have to leave the death zone at 7,500 meters and travel all the way down to base camp. We must leave the icy hell where Wiesner, Wolfe, and Pasang are currently trapped and descend to the relative safety and comfort at the foot of the mountain. Down in the valley, Dudley Cromwell, the expedition's second-in-command, is holding vigil. Alongside him is Jack Durrance. For more than a week, they have been scouring the silent, towering face of K2. Day after day, they pressed binoculars to their eyes, scanning the ice fields and jagged ridges, desperate for a speck of movement, a signal anything. But the mountain offers nothing but stone and silence. You have to understand their mindset. In the world of 1930s, mountaineering, a full week of radio silence, at that altitude led to only one logical conclusion. It meant the climbing party was never coming back. The flicker of hope that sustained them in the early days has been snuffed out, replaced by a grim, heavy acceptance. They have absolutely no clue that Wiesner and Passang were within shouting distance of the summit. They don't know that Dudley Wolfe has been fighting a one-man war for survival in the high camp for 9 days. All they know is the crushing silence. And so the waiting game ends. Cromwell makes the call. It is a harsh, pragmatic decision, but in his mind, it is the only logical path left. He issues the command to the Sherpas begin stripping the camps. The official justification he gives sounds almost insane in hindsight. The order is to salvage valuable equipment, specifically the sleeping bags. In his mind, he has already written off the men on the mountain as casualties, and his priority shifts to saving feathers and fabric for future expeditions rather than holding out hope for the living. Perhaps the final nail in the coffin was Durance's report. He had been sent up on a reconnaissance mission with specific orders to spot the signals Wiesner was supposed to leave in the snow. What did Durance actually see, or perhaps more importantly, what did he imagine he saw? To this day, historians argue over whether the visibility was simply too poor to see the signals or if he tragically misinterpreted what was there. But his report to Cromwell was absolute: there is nobody up there. And the Sherpas? They simply followed the chain of command. They did exactly as they were told. Instructed to clear the mountain, they executed the order with terrifying thoroughness. They didn't just grab the sleeping bags, they stripped it all. The cooking stoves, the rations, the medical kits, camp by camp. They methodically erased every single island of survival that had been left for the descending team, wiping them off the face of the mountain. They were completely oblivious to the horror they were causing. They didn't realize that every tent they collapsed was another door to survival being nailed shut for their friends above. That single administrative decision made in the warmth and safety of base camp transformed into a death warrant for the men fighting for their lives in the death zone. Without ever knowing it, Cromwell had severed the rope that tethered Wiesner, Wolfe, and Passang to the living world. The disaster on K2 isn't a story about a mountain conquering humans. It is a tragedy engineered by a single catastrophic choice, a fatal misinterpretation of the silence. A perfect storm of bad luck and human error had finally snapped shut, trapping 3 climbers in the desolate wasteland of Camp 7, a prison constructed for them unknowingly by their own teammates. And now we return to the high altitude, to the freezing hellscape of Camp 7. After their frantic search of the empty tents, Wiesner and Passang crawled back to Wolfe, not with supplies, but with empty hands. They look into the tent, and what stares back isn't their strong companion, but a man whose spirit seems to have already departed, left behind somewhere on the high ridges near the summit. Just try to picture the scene: 3 men pushed beyond exhaustion, huddled together in a single layer of fabric at nearly 8,000 meters. It is the night of July 23rd, bleeding into the 24th. They have no sleeping bags to hold heat. They have no food to burn for energy. They have absolutely no strength left. A lethal cold begins to seep into their marrow, turning the thin nylon of the tent from a shelter into a walk-in freezer. Every gust of wind hits them like a physical hammer. Sleep is impossible. They just lie there in the dark, listening to the screaming wind and the wheezing sound of their own dying breaths, trying desperately to share whatever body heat remains. When morning finally breaks, the fog of hopelessness has become suffocating. Fritz Wiesner looks at Dudley Wolfe and sees the brutal reality. He doesn't just see a friend or a sponsor anymore. He sees 90 kilograms of dead weight that somehow has to be maneuvered down the sheer vertical cliffs of the Black Pyramid. As for Wolfe, the light has gone out of his eyes. He stares at nothing with a vacant, glazed look. It goes beyond physical exhaustion. It is a total spiritual collapse. His body refuses to obey his mind because his will to survive has simply evaporated. He cannot take a single step on the treacherous ice. Wiesner, drawing on his mastery of the mountains, assesses the situation with cold, mathematical clarity. He looks at Wolfe, then mentally traces the route down the steep ice couloirs, the razor-sharp rock spines. They possess neither the physical strength nor the necessary gear to lower a man in Wolfe's condition safely. Attempting to carry him down right now would be a suicide pact for all 3 of them. It is a brutal, simple equation of survival, and there are no happy solutions. Forced into a corner, Wiesner makes the hardest decision of his life. It is July 24th. He and Pasang Lama must descend, alone. They have to leave Wolfe behind in this frozen tomb race down the mountain as fast as possible and return with a rescue party with fresh Sherpa's ropes and hot tea. He leans into Wolfe, but what words can possibly suffice? In a moment like that, he makes a solemn vow. He swears on his life that he will return. Hang on, Dudley. We're going to get down and bring back help. We are coming back for you. Perhaps Wolfe gives a small nod. Or perhaps he simply stares through Wiesner, his mind already drifting away from reality. With that heavy burden, Wiesner and Pasang Lama step out of the tent, check their gear one last time, and begin the lonely climb down. And Dudley Wolfe is left behind, alone once more. He sits in an empty tent surrounded by the silent, towering giants of the Himalayas with nothing but a promise to hold on to as his lifeline. For him, time stretches and warps, slowing to a crawl as he waits for the sound of footsteps in the snow that might never come. But for Wiesner, the mountain has transformed into a ticking clock, and he is losing the race. Every single minute of delay isn't just wasted time, it is actively leeching the remaining vitality from his stranded friend. Every step Wiesner and Pasang take on their chaotic descent is fueled by a frantic, desperate need to beat the odds. They are no longer climbing with caution. They are practically throwing themselves down the treacherous, icy slopes, driven by the haunting mental image of Dudley Wolfe trapped alone in his freezing, high-altitude prison. A solitary driving obsession hammers in their minds reach the lower camps at all costs. They are fantasizing about what awaits them, their teammates ready to help, the warmth of thick, goose-down sleeping bags, and the restorative power of a hot meal. They play the scenario over and over in their heads. They will rally the support crew, quickly assemble a fresh rescue team, and turn right back around to save their friend. However, when they finally stumble into Camp 6, pushed beyond the brink of physical exhaustion, they are not greeted by friends or food, but by a soul-crushing silence. The tents stand vacant. The sleeping bags, the stoves, and the critical supplies they had cached for this very moment are nowhere to be found. Someone has stripped the camp bare. This goes far beyond a simple logistical error. This is a catastrophe of lethal proportions. The foundation of their entire survival strategy, which relied heavily on the assumption of support from the lower mountain, has disintegrated in an instant. Instead of the sanctuary they had been hallucinating about during the descent, they are standing in a barren, icy wasteland. A dawn of horror breaks over Wiesner as the truth sinks in. There is no one waiting for them. The team below has given them up for dead and abandoned the mountain. In the blink of an eye, what was supposed to be a rescue mission has mutated into a frantic struggle for their own personal survival. The solemn promise they made to return for Wolfe now feels like a vow that is impossible to honor. Yet hope is not entirely extinguished. After a brutal descent all the way to base camp arriving, frostbitten and barely able to remain upright, Wiesner manages to gasp out the terrifying reality of the situation. And it is here, amidst the wreckage of the expedition, that we witness a genuine miracle of the human spirit. On July 28th, immediately upon hearing of Wolfe's desperate and lonely plight, 3 Sherpas, Pasang Kikuli Finsu and Sering Norbu, step forward. There is no hesitation, no debate. They simply volunteer. They will go back up into the death zone. This is not merely another climb for a paycheck. It is a willing plunge into the unknown void. They understand perfectly that the odds of success are microscopic, but for these men, concepts like duty, loyalty, and honor are not just empty rhetoric, they are a way of life. And so they begin an ascent that defies all logic, pulling off a physical feat that is nothing short of incredible. In the span of a single day, the 3 men rocket from base camp all the way to the slopes just below Camp 7, conquering a staggering 2,000 meters of vertical gain. To put that massive effort into perspective, imagine climbing the stairs of the Empire State Building more than 4 times in a row without rest. Now imagine doing that in the thin, oxygen-starved air of the Himalayas on near vertical walls of ice. Their rapid movement up the slopes acts as a single pulsing vein of life on the otherwise cold, dead body of the mountain. Against all odds, they reach their objective. As they approach the high-altitude tent, which sits in an eerie silence, they peer through the canvas opening. The image that greets them is one that will be seared into their memories forever. Dudley Wolfe is still alive. That is the first shock to their systems. The man is breathing, which itself is a miracle. but his condition is horrific. He has absolutely no food left. He is found sitting upright in the tent, completely alone, trapped in a state of profound apathy and listlessness, surrounded by the waste and detritus of his days in solitary confinement. The air inside the small space is heavy, stagnant, and foul. The Sherpas attempt to engage him, offering the hot tea they have carried up from below. They immediately notice the severity of his decline. Wolfe cannot even perform the simple task of tying his bootlaces. His frostbitten fingers refuse to obey his commands, and his will to live seems to have completely abandoned him. He stares back at his rescuers with a gaze that is blank, empty, and devoid of recognition. They plead with him, urging, "Let's go. We will help you down. We need to leave this place right now." But the response they receive is spoken in a quiet, lifeless monotone. Wolfe asks them to leave him be and to return tomorrow. He begs them to just wait for the morning sun. In his hypoxia-addled mind, time has lost all meaning, and the urgency of the situation is lost on him. He no longer possesses the cognitive ability to understand that every second spent at this altitude brings him one step closer to the abyss. To the Sherpas, however, his request sounds like a death sentence. They know they cannot survive a night at this extreme altitude without proper camping gear. Forced to bow to the incomprehensible logic of a dying man, they make a fateful decision. They decide they will descend to the shelter of Camp 6 to survive the night with the intention of climbing back up to retrieve him at first light. They leave him their remaining food supplies and turn to leave, descending with a terrible, heavy sense of foreboding in their hearts. The date is July 29th. The following morning greets the rescuers with a deceptive calm. The sky over K2 is suspiciously clear, possessing an almost unnatural, pristine beauty. The three Sherpas, Pasankikuli, Pasankitar, and Finsu, begin heading back up the mountain. This is no longer just a job. They are on a crusade to save a man whose existence now rests entirely in their hands. Stuffed into their packs are food rations, warm gear, and the very last glimmer of hope for Dudley Wolfe. Every step they take upward is a step further into the danger zone. They are fully aware of the immense risk they are courting by heading back into an altitude where life hangs by the thinnest of threads. But in their minds, turning back now would mean betraying not only a client, but their own deep sense of honor. These are men for whom the high peaks are more than a workplace. They are a part of their very soul. Up here in the thin air, the code of brotherhood is etched into the glaciers themselves. They are climbing because for them, there is simply no other moral choice. Among this brave trio, one man stands out above the rest, Pasankikuli. He is not merely an experienced guide, he is a living legend in the climbing community. 5 years prior, in 1934, he was present on Nanga Parbat during the horrific tragedy that claimed 9 lives. He was one of the very few who managed to escape the icy, lethal grip of the notorious Killer Mountain. He has witnessed firsthand how the mountains can claim the very best climbers. He knows intimately the terrible price of a single mistake. His presence here on the unforgiving slopes of K2 instills a sense of confidence in the others. They believe that if anyone can pull off a miracle rescue in these conditions, it is him. He is a walking symbol of resilience, a man who has stared directly into the abyss and forced it to blink. It feels as though his vast experience and his survivor's luck will act as a shield for the entire team. But K2 is not Nanga Parbat. This mountain operates by its own brutal set of rules, and it keeps its own tally of the dead. Far below, in the safety of the lower camps, the rest of the expedition watches through telescopes, their eyes fixed on 3 tiny black specks moving against the vast white slope. The hours tick by slowly. The figures crawl upward steady and determined, getting closer to the shelter of the tent at Camp 7, and just then the mountain decides to reveal its true terrible face. Rolling in from the west, a menacing white haze begins to consume the peak. At first, it appears as just a light mist, but it rapidly thickens into heavy, opaque clouds that cling to the rocks like a predator stalking its prey. The wind, which had been merely a whisper, begins to howl quickly, escalating into a deafening, roaring gale. The storm has arrived with a vengeance. Those watching helplessly from below see the 3 brave specks reach the ice ridge near the high camp. And then they are gone. They simply vanish into the churning white chaos of the blizzard. No human eye would ever see them again. Hours of anxious waiting stretch into agonizing days, but not a single dark shape ever reappears on the slope. The storm rages relentlessly for days, scrubbing the mountain clean of any trace of them, burying every possible path under tons of fresh snow. When the weather finally breaks and the skies clear, the mountain slope is empty. Blank. Dudley Wolfe. Pasankikuli, Pasankitar, and Finsu have vanished without a trace. The mountain has claimed them all. The loss of 3 of the absolute finest Sherpas of their generation sends a shockwave of grief through the entire global climbing community. It is an irreplaceable loss. These men were not just hired guides, they were the keepers of unique, high-altitude experience, possessors of immense courage and examples of an unbelievable dedication to their craft. Their names are now forever etched into the icy tragic history of K2 symbols of a noble sacrifice that was ultimately powerless against the blind frozen fury of the elements. The tragedy of 1939 was finally over. The mountain had taken its final, cruelest toll on the expedition. The mountain falls silent, its blood price paid in full. But down below in the world of men, a new and no less vicious storm is brewing. It is a storm of accusations, toxic rumors, and half-truths. When Fritz Wiesner, exhausted, frostbitten, and utterly broken by grief, finally makes his way down to civilization, he is not met with sympathy or comfort. Instead, he is met with a wall of ice-cold hostility. The ringleader of his accusers is Jack Durrance, supported by the expedition leader Dudley Cromwell. Their narrative is simple, devastating, and entirely self-serving. They claim Wiesner, obsessed with reaching the summit, callously left his client for dead. In their version of events, he is the sole villain. And so begins a quiet, dirty war, fought on paper and in committee rooms. The American Alpine Club, an elite organization that counted both Cromwell and Durrance as members, is faced with a difficult choice: admit to the systemic failures in the expedition's planning that they oversaw, or find a single person to blame for everything. The choice they make is obvious. Wiesner, with his thick German accent and his blunt, no-nonsense attitude, is the perfect scapegoat for the American club. The official expedition report is a carefully crafted document designed specifically to protect the reputation of the club and its prominent members while throwing Wiesner to the wolves. Facts are twisted. Blame is shifted. And for decades, following the disaster, the name Fritz Wiesner becomes synonymous with recklessness, arrogance, and selfishness. His brilliant, near-successful ascent is wiped from the history books, replaced by the caricature of a man who blindly led his companions to their doom. And what about Dudley Wolfe? In this new sanitized official version of the story, he is cast in a deeply unflattering role. He is painted as a wealthy tourist, a spoiled amateur who bought his way onto a serious expedition and became a dangerous liability for the real professionals. The story propagated is that he was weak, unprepared for the rigors of the mountain, and that his presence was a mistake from the very start. It is a convenient narrative for everyone involved, as it absolves those who abandoned the high camps and stripped the supplies, and those who were too slow to send help when it mattered. After all, why should anyone risk their life for a man who only has himself to blame? And so for years, the memory of Wolfe becomes a caricature, a cautionary tale for other wealthy adventurers with mountain dreams. But facts are stubborn things, and they eventually surface to tell a very different story. Let us simply look at the raw numbers. Dudley Wolfe spent an incredible 38 days living above an altitude of 7,000 meters. 38 days in the death zone, where the human body is slowly deteriorating. He survived multiple vicious storms all alone in a tiny tent pinned to a precarious icy slope. Where is the weakness in that performance? Where is the amateurism? These are the signs of incredible, almost superhuman endurance. He survived conditions where many seasoned professional climbers would have given up and died days earlier. He was not a victim of his own physical weakness. He was the victim of a total systemic collapse of the support system that was sworn to protect him. The vital lifeline of communication and essential supplies, which should have been his only salvation, had been completely severed. He found himself isolated in the void, but not due to any frailty of his own spirit or lack of will. The true cause of his abandonment lay far below him, where a toxic mix of chaotic mismanagement, paralyzing indecision, and perhaps even the settling of old, bitter personal grudges had taken priority over a man's life. It would take another 63 years before the mountain finally deigned to release its grip on the buried truth. In the year 2002, climbers Jennifer Jordan and Eric Meyer made a chilling discovery at the desolate site of Camp 7. Amidst the debris of a disintegrating tent, scattered human bones, and weather-beaten equipment from a bygone era, they unearthed a specific haunting artifact. Lying in the snow was a single mitten, a humble piece of wool that had once warmed the hands of Dudley Wolfe. This poignant discovery, a tiny frozen relic from the past, speaks volumes more than any dry official report or sterile investigation ever managed to convey. It effectively resurrects Dudley Wolfe from the pages of history, stripping away the statistics to restore his lost humanity. With this find, he sheds the dismissive label of the wealthy tourist that history books and official accounts had pinned on him for decades. Instead, he emerges once again as a real person, a desperate man who waged a lonely war for survival until his very last heartbeat trapped in one of the most unforgiving and savage environments on Earth. That solitary mitten stands as a silent, enduring monument to his immense courage in the face of inevitable death. It serves as physical proof of a tragedy that was infinitely more layered, dark, and complicated than the sanitized version the official story tried to sell to the world.